is Dr. Joy O'Keefe. Joy is an assistant professor and wildlife extension specialist at U of I. So Joy, welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Erin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to talk to you today about providing natural and artificial homes for bats, which is something I think about a lot in my research. I have been studying bats for about 23 or 24 years now and go out every summer to catch bats, and like this cute little red bat here. And then we oftentimes put little radio tracking devices on them and track bats to figure out where they are roosting, which gives us this information that I can share with you today. So first off, I want to start with why should you care about bats? Well, I think that you all already know that because you're here on this call. There's probably over 80 people here, so that's fantastic. I'm really excited to see all of you so enthusiastic about bats. But if you weren't already aware, bats are facing a lot of risks, threats to their populations, and they're some of our more imperiled animals, especially here in Illinois. Overall, bats are really just incredible creatures. They're really remarkably diverse animals with a wide range of diets and habits and morphological features like this vampire bat here. Of course, we don't have vampire bats in Illinois, but we have some pretty incredible bats nonetheless doing really exciting stuff. So out of the 1,461 or 69 bats that are known worldwide right now, that number keeps increasing incrementally every year. Many of them are insectivores, and so they're really valuable to us providing pest control services. But around the world, we also have bats that are frugivores, eating fruit, nectarivores, eating nectar, piscivores, which eat fish, carnivores, that includes bats that eat birds, frogs, other bats. And then we have the sanguivores, which is the 3 vampire bat species that eat blood. So how many bat species do you think occur in Illinois? If you want to type that into the chat, Erin is going to give me your guesses. Out of those 1,469 species in Illinois, or in the world, how many of those occur in Illinois? So if any of you can type your answers in the chat, Erin will tell me what you said.
We are getting a bunch.
Cool.
3, 17, 14, 40, 15, 3 to 4, 200. I love that guess. 10, 4, 6.
So most people are guessing low numbers of bats, and you are correct. So one of the reasons that Illinois doesn't have as much diversity as, say, Ecuador is because part of the year is quite cold, and that really limits the feeding opportunities available for bats and thus limits diversification. Also, our structural environment is not as diverse as in the tropics, and that's one of the hypotheses for why there's so much diversity around the tropics. So in certain sites in Costa Rica, moving down south to Ecuador, you could capture 100 different species of bats in a particular site. But here in Illinois, we have 13 species of bats. So I heard 15 from one person, and that is pretty close. We have 2 occasional species that show up in Illinois. And so we are a pretty diverse state relative to the rest of the Midwest, but we're not particularly diverse compared to the rest of the world. So of those 13 bats, you'll find them all down in southern Illinois. There's no one that's not found in southern Illinois. That is a very diverse place because of all the karst habitat, the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi River Valley, and kind of the southern influence that comes there. As you move north in Illinois, we get less diversity. So up near Chicagoland, you might only have 4 or 6 species, depending on where you are. But frankly, there's still a lot we don't know about bats, and we don't know about their distributions. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's still some surprises out there in terms of what occurs where in Illinois. So bats are really valuable to us because they're eating pests in Illinois that are eating crops, forests, and us. So when we look at the top 5 major types of prey in the diets of 2 species of bats, the northern long-eared bat and the Indiana bat, Number one on the list is crane flies, and crane flies harm no one, so they're kind of just a big bumbling cousin of the mosquito. But number two is mosquitoes, and of course, those are pests to humans and vectors of pathogens that cause disease. Number three is midge flies, small biting flies that also are pathogens, vectors. Apologize for the noise in the background. I'm in a hotel. There's people yelling. And then moths, small, tiny moths that eat leaves. Those are also a problem for our vegetation, including forests and crops, and then leaf hoppers, which are insects, true bugs that pierce leaves and suck the juices out of them. So bats have been shown to be really valuable for pest control. It's estimated that they provide potentially billions of dollars in ecosystem services just to the corn and soy industry in the US, but that hasn't been really well quantified, and it's hard to scale those effects up to the massive amounts of corn and soy that we grow, for example, in Illinois. But smaller scale, when we look at some crops like grapes or rice or orchards that are growing smaller amounts of any particular crop, definitely bats are shown to have a really valuable effect on pest control. So they're really beneficial to us. Importantly, when we're thinking about bats and we're thinking about providing roosts for them, we need to recognize that bats are really a slow-lived species, much more like us than like rodents. So the Germans call bats die Fledermaus, the flying mouse, but they could not be farther from a mouse. Bats actually have pretty incredibly long lives, on average 18 to 26 years for little brown bats. And the record for bat longevity is a bat called Myotis branchi, which was found to be 41 years in Russia. So bats really live a long time, and they actually show tremendous fidelity to the sites where they roost, coming back year after year to the same sites. So this map here on the right is from a publication from a student of mine, where we were able to track the locations of bats that we had banded during the summer at the site indicated by the star, which is near Indianapolis in Indiana, to caves in south central and southern Indiana. And we could see that these bats were moving back and forth between these areas. So they show fidelity not only to the caves where they hibernate during the winter, but also to the summer site, coming back year after year to the small patch of woods. So that's really important to think about when we're thinking about providing habitat for bats. And I'll talk later about different types of roosts that bats use. And it actually doesn't matter how ephemeral the roost is. Bats, if they found a good place to roost, they'll come back to that site year after year and just look for a new roost if the old roost is gone. So some global threats to bats that is important to be aware of are habitat loss. And this is thought to be most prominent when we think of logging that removes forests entirely, like they're never coming back. And then also harvesting plants, which could be devastating to bats that roost in plants. Intensive agriculture can be problematic for bats because it can be done in conjunction with habitat loss, but also because intensive agriculture can involve lots of energy use, pesticide use, and herbicide use, and those can all be problematic for bats for bioaccumulation of chemicals. Human disturbance is a problem for bats. In some parts of the world, bats are hunted, not so much in Illinois, right? Because our bats are so tiny, no one would think to eat them. And of course, we don't normally eat things like that in nature, but in some parts of the world where food is limiting, bats are eaten, and bats can be much bigger. But really in Illinois, intrusions, just like in other parts of the world, can be problematic for bats because people are disturbing bats while they're hibernating or while they're roosting, and causing them to need to leave their roosts and burn up energy that's valuable. And then urban development is also a problem for bats because we're taking away habitat, but also adding some other stressors like light pollution and noise pollution, which could be problematic for our night flying friends. So in the United States, we kind of rank the big stressors to bats as habitat loss, wind energy, and disease. I can't really differentiate between wind energy and disease as in terms of which is worse because they affect different groups of bats. So we'll start with white nose syndrome, which is a disease that is killing cave hibernating bats. So this disease is caused by a fungus that was novel, introduced to North America. We think back in the early 2000s, we first detected it in 2006 in New York. And this fungus will grow on bats while they're hibernating. And it actually causes disturbance to the bats. It causes them to wake up and burn through their fat reserves, as well as being somewhat necrotic, eating away at their tissues, causing damage to their wing membranes, which makes it difficult for them to fly, as well as to regulate energy when they are flying. So this has caused the deaths of millions of bats. And species that are most affected include our federally endangered Indiana bat, which was already listed as endangered since the inception of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. The federally endangered gray bat, a close cousin in the same genus Myotis, also endangered since the mid-1970s. The northern long-eared bat, which was once one of the most common bats that we would capture in Illinois, in my lifetime as a bat biologist in just the past 24 years, I've seen that bat go from being so common that you would be pretty much guaranteed to capture it no matter where you surveyed, to, as long as there was forest, to being federally threatened in 2015 and then upgraded to federally endangered just this year. And that's due to declines from white nose syndrome. So now it is actually more common to catch the endangered Indiana bat than to catch the northern long-eared bat. The little brown bat is an interesting one. It's a species that's found across much of North America, including Canada and the Western US. And it's actually historically been considered kind of a nuisance species for people. It was often found in people's houses, but was thought to already be declining before white nose syndrome came around, because big brown bats were pushing them out of houses, and little browns didn't have anywhere to roost because their natural habitat was gone. It's being considered for listing as federally endangered, but that decision has not come down the pike yet. And that's probably because of the fact that it's so widespread. And in some places, it's still doing well, even though in other places like the Northeast, it has declined really precipitously from white nose syndrome. And we see that to some degree in Illinois as well. The tricolored bat is a really unique bat out of this group. It's in a different genus, as you can see, and it has different habits in terms of where it roosts. While the other bats pictured here all roost in cavities or crevices in trees during the summer, and then in caves during the winter. Well, actually, sorry, the gray bat roosts exclusively in caves, but the other three bats roost in trees and then caves. The tricolored bat actually roosts in tree foliage, so it could pretty much roost in any tree that has leaves on it during the summer, but it roosts in caves during the winter. And it's thought to be kind of a long distance migrant, even though it's the smallest bat here. And so it is also impacted by wind energy. But habitat loss is an even greater threat to our bats. As I mentioned, most of these bats live in live or dead trees during the summer. So some examples are pictured here. You could have tens to potentially a couple hundred bats in the tree at left, or in the tree in the center, roosting under the sloughing bark of these dead trees. Bats will also roost in, for example, woodpecker cavities. I was just eating lunch with somebody a few minutes ago who was telling me that they had 80 bats come out of a woodpecker cavity in a cottonwood tree in Northern California. So that definitely occurs. Bats also will roost in foliage. So if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see an eastern red bat with a little transmitter that we glued to its back, which is dangling to the left side. And this bat is roosting in the a downed scarlet oak on the top of a ridge, where the tree, you've seen these trees when you're hiking through the woods, that's just chock full of red colored leaves. Well, now every time I see a tree like that, I stop and examine it to see if I can find a bat. And dang it, I've never found one, but this one took us right to a tree like that. So these bats that are affected by white nose syndrome are using these tree cavities and crevices. And this is the type of natural roost that we really want to provide for these bats. But these types of roosts are incredibly rare on the landscape, right? We cut over all of our forests pretty much in the East and most of the West as well before the turn of the 20th century. And now our forests are regrowing, and what we consider to be big trees aren't really all that big, and they don't have as many features as we would like to support these large populations of bats. But bats are very adaptable, and they will find places to roost in trees. Even a relatively small tree like the one at the center I think a red maple that died. And here the bat is roosting under the bark on the right side. You can actually see its transmitter sticking out that's hanging off the back of the bat. And you could fit a handful of bats under the bark there, not a huge group, but if there's a cavity in the tree, then it could support even more. So because bats are so reliant on forests, forests are a strong predictor of where we find bats in Illinois. So a few years ago, I had the occasion to work with a grad student named Ash Cable, who put together this analysis trying to figure out where Indiana bats, which is this federally endangered species, would be found in Illinois. And the darker colored patches on the map, the darker colored green, those are areas where they're more likely to be found. And you can see that those areas are places where we have larger tracts of forest, typically either associated with our Shawnee National Forest in the southern part of the state, or river stream corridors that have substantial riparian buffers of trees around them. So those are important places for bats. And Illinois was not historically the most forested state. We did have a lot of prairie. We know nothing about where bats were roosting in those prairie landscapes and if they were roosting in natural features, but there were probably scattered trees that bats would have used, as well as rocks that could have provided roosting habitat. So now we've really contracted our forest in parts of the state where forest was prevalent. And bats are still finding those patches of forest, though. If we look for, a linear corridor that connects to another linear corridor, where those are found, you're going to have bats. And so we need to be thinking about protecting and actually also basically restoring the conditions that will be optimal for bats that need to roost in forests. So let's talk about how we can provide habitat for bats. And you might be wondering about bat boxes. I talk to people pretty regularly about bats, and this is the number one question that I get is, what about bat boxes? Should I put up a bat box? And so I want to talk about these for a few minutes, and then I will also talk about natural roosts. Now, we have been doing research on bat boxes in my lab since 2012, and we started really deliberately doing research in 2015 when we put up some boxes for federally endangered Indiana bats to use in an area where they were already using bat boxes. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the regulatory authority for this endangered species, asked me, well, why are you putting up bat boxes here? These bats are adapted for trees. If you're going to put up bat boxes, we really want you to have a research question, because you might be basically changing the behavior of these bats and causing them to be tied to bat boxes. And they could not have been more right. I have been studying this one population of bats near Indianapolis for many years now, and the bats are essentially tied to bat boxes, and they're using that area still because we have provided bat boxes for them. There are virtually no good natural roosts left on that landscape that the bats will use, and they're very tied to bat boxes. And this is an example of one of those boxes, and Indiana bats emerging from that box, captured by a professional photographer, Michael Durham. So what are bat boxes? These are artificial roosts for bats, typically made out of wood. If you look at the tree on the left side, you'll see a really old box on the right side of the tree that was put up in the mid-1990s and still hanging on the tree as of about 2010, 2012. But we put a new box up beside it to try to give bats a newer roost structure. In the center, you can see some bat boxes made by biologists in California with the California Transportation Department. They were actually put underneath a bridge where bats were roosting in the seams of the bridge, and they wanted to provide them with another place to roost under the bridge. And they were really flummoxed because they built these 3 bat boxes. They were pretty expensive to build, took a lot of effort, and the bats refused to use 2 of them, and they only used 1 of them. And then on the right side of the screen is another type of artificial roost conceived by some colleagues in Kentucky, which is an artificial bark that is meant to mimic the bark on a tree. It's made out of a rubber polyurethane material that wraps around a post, and the bats crawl underneath that and are much more snug inside there against the post, kind of as if they were roosting under the bark on a dead tree. So all of these have been deployed for use by bats in various circumstances, and they have different pros and cons for bats depending on how they're deployed. So which type of bats are going to use these artificial roosts or bat houses? Well, we commonly think of bats that will roost in the cavities and crevices of dead trees, but there are other bats that will also use these roosts. And this bat here is the federally endangered Indiana bat. And when it first was detected using a box just like this one on the right side, which has probably about 40 Indiana bats in the box, it was really surprising to folks that they would use bat boxes. But in certain places where bat boxes have been deployed for them, these bats are regularly using them, and they come back year after year to the same boxes, and they use them in a similar pattern each year, moving amongst the structures according to their energetic demands as they need more sun or less sun, or more space or less space. So these bats can fit into really tiny spots. They're pretty small bats. So the picture on the left shows a crevice in a bridge, actually, but this is a typical spacing for a bat box. About 3/4 of an inch or 2 centimeters is just the amount of space that's perfect for bats to squeeze into these spaces. And you can cram tens to hundreds or even thousands of bats into a bat box, depending on the size. Now, other bats that historically roosted in large hollow trees will also use bat boxes, and sometimes they like much bigger structures. And folks will deploy really large bat houses or condos to support these bats that roost in larger trees. But we don't know a lot about the roosting habits of some of these bats, and so we're kind of just guessing. And another species that we don't currently have in Illinois, but that may eventually establish in our state, it shows up occasionally, just incidental, is the Mexican free-tailed bat. And that is a bat that is found across a lot of the southern United States, and it roosts historically in caves. So there are giant caves in Texas and the desert Southwest and Arizona and New Mexico that can house hundreds to thousands to even millions of Mexican free-tailed bats. And those bats have started to move into human structures like buildings and bridges. And in certain places, they will roost in bat boxes. So if you remember those boxes that I showed you on the bottom of the bridge in Southern California, it's roosts like that and bridges that have attracted Mexican free-tailed bats to Southern California. There were no natural roosts there for them prior to folks putting up these artificial structures. Of course, we didn't put up bridges to provide habitat for bats, but bats moved in nonetheless, and now they have a whole new species there. So I think it's important to consider that we can significantly alter, not only bat behavior, but also bat communities by providing these artificial roosts. So big brown bats are one of those bats that we think historically roosted in these really large hollow trees. And this is one of the most common bat house users in North America. So when folks put up bat houses from Nova Scotia, or I should probably go a little bit west, somewhere in Montreal, over to British Columbia and down to Northern California and even to South Carolina, you could expect big brown bats to roost in your box. They are a very common bat, and they're actually the most common bat that we will find in our houses and in our barns. So around Champaign County, where I'm based, if someone has bats in their barn, it is invariably going to be big brown bats. Big brown bats are not imperiled. They're doing quite well. And the evening bat is another bat that we commonly find using artificial roost structures, and they are also not imperiled and doing well. So when you're thinking about whether or not bat boxes are going to be an important tool for conservation, recognize that your most likely bat box users are these species in Illinois. So what attracts bats to use bat boxes? The number one thing is probably going to be solar exposed position, but if there's not good foraging habitat or places for bats to eat, then they probably won't come to that. So if you put up a bat box in the middle of a baseball field, it's very unlikely that bats will move into that, or even in the middle of a cornfield. But if you put the bat box close to some forest that bats can forage in, then now they're much more likely to use it. The size and the structure of a bat box is really important as well. So bats key in on spacious and warm roosts. And so they look at the size of the roost. They'll consider how warm it is when they pop in there in the morning. Usually bats are selecting their roosts right at dawn. And they don't really know how warm a roost is going to get throughout the course of the day. So they just have to make that decision based on what they feel at dawn, but they'll change their minds if the roost gets too hot or never gets hot enough. They may not use that roost in the future. Like I said, proximity to places where bats can find bugs to eat is important. Also, other occupied roosts. So if you put up a bat house near another occupied bat house, it's likely the bats will eventually move in if it's a good structure. And we think that cues from other bats are probably pretty important, but we don't have a ton of evidence for that. We have done in my lab a couple of experiments in Minnesota and Florida where we actually played vocalizations from our target species to try to draw them into bat boxes. And in the picture in the center, this is an example of our experimental site in Florida. And we played the calls of a bat that uses bat houses in Florida for over a year before any bats moved into this cluster. And then it was a different species that moved in. But we think that that different species actually then attracted the attention of our target species. And we had one individual move into a bat box. So after a year of playing its calls, it was actually the other species that probably attracted it to the box. But flying around boxes, the odors from bats, those are also potentially things that could attract bats to use bat houses. So how do we know if a bat house is successful? Well, when we put up a bat house, the way that pretty much everybody evaluates success, including me for a long time, was just by whether or not bats were using it, by bat presence. You know, are there bats there? Woohoo! Yes, good. This is great. And wait, oh, there's, tens to hundreds of bats in this box. This must be an awesome box. This is great. So by the numbers, right? But when we think about the success of conservation measures for any animal, what we really should be thinking about, I would argue, is whether or not it increases fitness. So do pups make it to adulthood? Do bats successfully reproduce and produce pups that are able to then reproduce themselves? And are the occupants in bat houses healthy? And this is, as I said, true for any conservation measure that we apply to any species that we're trying to recover. We have to think about, what is making it really actually good for bats? Because just like people, bats don't always know what is good for them. And I would argue that bat boxes are not always effective as conservation tools. Some of the concerns I have about bat boxes are that we're often painting them too dark colors, and we're thinking that color alone is going to produce the suitable microclimate that bats need to be healthy in a box, and it's not. Dark boxes tend to overheat, but once the sun falls and it's dark out, dark boxes provide no additional benefits to bats. Just like our houses, we should be thinking about insulating boxes and adding more thermal mass to create a warmer structure that's more stable in temperature. Bat boxes can fall apart. Sometimes they're made from inappropriate materials, such as the one at the center and at the right that were made out of plywood, which eventually squirrels will chew to pieces or will warp. And if you add mesh to the inside of a bat box, then invariably it's going to fall apart, or it's going to kind of scrunch up and create less than optimal roosting conditions for bats. And when we leave these boxes up and then don't maintain them or monitor them, then we're really doing bats a disservice. And there's probably much more effective things we could have done with our money to augment habitat for bats than to provide these short-lived artificial roosts that don't kind of sustain themselves. They need attention or they're not going to be effective. So some other concerns that I've already mentioned a little bit is that many boxes offer unsuitably hot or cold temperatures. If you go into a store to buy a bat box, it's often going to be way too small and not going to be suitable for the types of colonies that like to occupy boxes. Poor color choices. Usually people are painting their boxes too dark, in my opinion, and not thinking about the actual benefits of using a larger box that has more thermal mass and that has insulation to make it more stable in temperature. And these decisions can actually lead to bat deaths, not just from overheating, but also from freezing. So there were bats that froze to death in a bat box in Florida a few years back because they had an unusually cold snap, and these bats were adapted to using bat boxes and didn't have an alternative roost site. Bat boxes, because they can stay up for longer periods of time than, say, a little piece of bark on the side of a dead tree, bats may use them year after year, and that can increase their exposure to predators and parasites. So in the bottom right picture there, you see the inside of a bat box that we dissected. It had been up for 3 summers in central Indiana. And when we dissected these boxes, we found between hundreds and thousands of bat bugs in these individual boxes. And these are parasites that actually feed usually on the young, taking a blood meal from young and then hiding in the box during the day and at night while mom is out foraging. So it turns out that bat boxes can actually be host sites for these parasites, and they can actually overwinter in these sites and just wait for the bats to come back the next year. Sometimes bat boxes are deployed in pretty low quality habitat sites like the one at the top right. And if a bat occupies that space or something like it, then they may be drawn to places where they have a difficult time finding food. So I think we have to be aware of where we're deploying these structures and be mindful of bats' need for lots of insects during the night. And as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of afraid that bats might lose a search image for their natural roosts. If we are drawing them to bat boxes repeatedly year after year, they may not know the cues to find these big dead trees, even if those are becoming more available as we restore landscapes. But what is the best scenario for deploying a bat box? Because I find that no matter who I talk to, people really want to do something beneficial for bats, and they really want to help them by providing habitat. So I would say that if you had a situation where your colony is already established and using human-made roosts, and you want to get them out of those human structures, like maybe you don't want bats in the attic, then a bat box might be a good idea. Now, of course, you will have to figure out a way to evict bats from a house, because a house is really just a gigantic bat box, and it's always going to offer more microclimates and space for bats than pretty much any bat box you could build. So bats will naturally be drawn to those structures. We want to use bat boxes in places where the surrounding foraging habitat is high quality. So if there is a good place for bats to forage, but there's not a good place for bats to roost, then maybe we can use bat boxes as a bridge to bats using natural habitat. So it should be coupled with efforts to grow trees, which I'll talk about more in just a moment, to actually provide bats with natural spaces to roost in the future. And you really have to think long term when you're thinking about this. So if you're providing bats with bat boxes, that might be something that's needed for many, many years to come while trees are growing up in the surrounding landscape. So can we provide bats with natural roost structures? You know, who of you is lucky enough to have a gigantic oak tree like this on your property? Oaks are fantastic trees. They provide lots of nooks and crevices for bats and for other wildlife to use. They're providing just tremendous space for insects. Oaks host a huge array of insects. So I think oaks are kind of just marvelous habitat for bats. They can live in them and eat in them, you know, without ever even leaving their home space. They could probably get plenty to eat. But we don't have a lot of trees like this on the landscape. So what would we be looking for? We really want to grow big trees with suitable characteristics if we want to create natural roosting spaces for bats. So do they need to be late successional old trees? So by late successional, I mean oaks or hickories or something that takes a long time to get big. And if you look at the graph on the left side of the screen, you'll see the maximum emergence count. This is the number of bats that we counted coming out of a tree versus the tree age. And there is no clear relationship between the age of the tree and the number of bats coming out of the tree. The line is virtually flat. We don't have that many trees that are greater than 150 years old in our sample, but this is from data that Joey Pettit and I collected in New Jersey the Southern Appalachian Mountains, and Central Indiana, measuring a lot of trees used by the endangered Indiana bat. And we really found no relationship there. What we did find a relationship with, though, is that the best predictor of the number of bats coming out of the tree was actually the size of the tree. And that's big trees that are key for producing larger numbers of bats. So if you want more bats, you need bigger trees. Now, do bigger trees need to be oaks and hickories? No. The fastest growing trees are going to actually be our early successional species like maples and poplars and cottonwoods. These are trees that can grow fast quickly and can actually provide bats with nice spaces to roost while we are also simultaneously growing up those oak trees, which are going to be habitat for bats later down the line. As I mentioned, you really have to think far out, though, because even a giant cottonwood that provides a nice space for tens to hundreds of bats to roost in could take at least 70 years to grow up. But I'll show you an example of some of the trees that Joey studied in these different landscapes. And what he did is he actually took tree cores from these trees and then aged the trees. And so on the left side of the screen, you have a tree that's 31 centimeters in diameter. That's the diameter across the base of the tree, about chest height. And the tree on the right is 50 centimeters in diameter. So the one on the right is bigger, but not that much bigger. The tree on the left was only 31 years old. So that tree it was basically growing a centimeter every year, right? Whereas the tree on the right, a slower growing late successional species, was growing at a much slower rate. Now, how did the bats use these trees? If we look at the populations of bats counted emerging from these trees, they're fairly similar, right? So both of these trees, an early successional and a late successional tree, can support bats. So I think it's important to have a mix of these on your property or wherever you are managing for bats if you're thinking about providing natural roosts. We can actually selectively girdle or kill some trees. This is an example of a girdled tree here at our study site in South Central Indiana on state forest land, where they are implementing timber harvests and cutting down some trees. They're actually also selectively killing some trees like red maples and poplars that they consider to be undesirable. They don't want those trees to be in the canopy in the future. They want more oaks and hickories because they're trying to restore oak and hickory forest where it has been largely lost due to lack of disturbance. And so these offer us an interesting opportunity to see how bats respond to them. And they actually respond pretty well. They will find these girdled trees. So this is an example of a girdled maple. It's a pretty big tree that my grad student Reed Crawford found in South Central Indiana. And this tree had over 220 bats, Indiana bats, roosting under the bark of this girdled tree. Now, these trees don't last forever. This tree was used in the summer of 2022. They went back to it in 2023, and it had fallen on the ground. And that is partly a facet of it being girdled, but you can see that even when they found it in 2022, it had been dead for a while. It had lost a lot of bark, and it could have been used by bats for several years. We just only found it in its last year of utility. Another thing I would advise is to remove non-native invasive woody plants. And this is a picture of, invasive bush honeysuckle in the understory of southern Indiana or southern Illinois woods. We will also see autumn olive growing along the edges and kind of encroaching into the forest in southern Illinois and also in Indiana. And these can inhibit the growth of our trees that we're trying to restore for bats. And so, removing those non-native invasive woody plants is only going to benefit forest restoration efforts. And of course, it's actually also going to make it easier for bats to forage in the woods because there will be more herbaceous cover that produces more insects for bats to eat and has more diversity. And then is also a less cluttered environment for bats to forage in. So some other ways you can help bats if you are not in a position to provide them with natural or artificial roosts is just to take the knowledge that you have about bats now and educate others. I heartily encourage you to do that. Protect and enhance natural areas wherever it is that you live, and really think about bats year round. We often associate bats with Halloween, or you might actually think about bats during the summer when they're most active in Illinois, but they are in our state and they're on our landscape year round. And so we do need to be thinking about limiting our disturbance in places where bats are roosting. Conserving energy will help us to limit the use of wind energy, which can save some of our migratory bats. And be thinking about providing clean water sources as well, because our bats definitely rely upon those. So lots of things that you can do to help bats besides just providing them with roosts. And I want to put in a plug for the next Everyday Environment webinar, which is on the Northern Saw-Whet Owl, which my colleague Mike Ibarra will talk about here soon. And I think that's sometime in December. Erin can tell us the date.
December 14th.
Okay. And then I want to encourage you to contact me if you have any questions about bats. And if you've typed questions into the chat, I guess I'll let Erin read those off and I'll be happy to answer them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joy, for that great presentation. I know I learned lots of new things about bats, and I'm sure everyone else at least picked up a nugget or two. We do have a few questions in the chat, and for those that are still on, and if you have questions, put those in, and we'll see if we can get to them. So going back to the beginning of the presentation, when you talked about how bats return to the same location year after year, can you talk a little bit about what we know about how that works, like how they find the same spots? And is that similar to how bird migration works, if you know? That was a question.
So bats are using magnetic orientation to find their way around the landscape. Folks have experimented with manipulating their, ability to orient with the stars and found that they can confuse them. But they also memorize landscape features. We think that rivers are really important for bats to migrate along. I'm actually at a conference in Louisville, Kentucky right now along the Ohio River, and it's a bunch of wildlife biologists. And in just 2 days' time, 3 different bats of 3 different species were found roosting on trees right beside the river or just a block away from the river, which is really strong evidence to me that rivers are really important for corridors for bats to fly upon. And I think that's probably true that our streams are natural corridors that bats are following just about anywhere. But they just have this ability to return to these same areas. I mean, this is true for birds, like someone noted, year after year, orienting probably with the stars and then also with these landscape features in a pretty incredible way. And they have a remarkable sense of timing too, so they'll show up roughly the same time every year as well.
Very cool. Thank you. We had a question about bats being in urban areas, and where do they go in the winter? Do they use our human-made structures for that purpose, or?
So there's not been much work on that, so we don't know for sure. Some of our human-made structures may be suitable. Bats do like it to be just a little bit above freezing during the winter. So if you had an attic space that would sit at around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that might be kind of perfect for bats to hibernate. They need to drop their body temperature and save energy because otherwise they're going to burn through their fat reserves because there's nothing to eat generally during the winter. But this can differ depending on which species you're talking about. So our most common house bat, the big brown bat, we rarely see in the winter when we survey hibernation sites. So we really don't know where most of them are going during the winter. They could be in rock crevices on the landscape. They could be it needs to be somewhere that's sheltered, but they could also be in buildings. A lot of barns, if you have bats in a barn, are going to be unsuitable during the winter because there's just too much wind whipping through them, too many cracks and crevices for the wind to get in. And so there's not going to be sufficient warmth. So bats are either using insulated spaces that are still cold, or they are migrating to other areas where there are those types of spaces. A friend of mine studied big brown bats in Dinosaur Provincial National Park in Canada and found that they were going into rock crevices about a meter or two deep, and they were able to survive the winters in this incredibly harsh, cold environment just by going a couple meters deep into a rock crevice. So look closely at our rock habitat in Illinois. You may just find some. Some amateur herpetologists in Southern Illinois were sending me pictures a few winters ago. Every time they would go out to look for salamanders in rock crevices, they would find bats. And oftentimes those were big brown bats. So it could be that they're just in the rocks.
We had a question that came in early, so it hopefully got answered in the presentation, but still important to talk about, I think. Someone was asking, how big does a dead tree need to be to provide value and attract bats? And they were saying, kind of referring to the height of the tree. And I know we talked more about like diameter and maybe more like the type of tree. Would that be kind of what you'd look for?
Yeah, so it depends on the bat. It depends on the type of tree as to how tall it can get, and then it depends on the solar exposure. So some species, like the northern long-eared bat, will roost in just about any type of tree, any size in terms of height, and also diameter, and also the height off the ground. Right. So we'll find bats at kind of eye level shooting out of little cavities in the side of a tree. It would really surprise you. You would think that they would need more solar exposure and that they would want to be a little bit higher off the ground, but they're a really small bat and they don't need to catch a ton of air to get flight. So it's easier for them to fly out of a surface or out of a hole that's only, say head height for me and still be able to take off. Whereas maybe a big brown bat is going to want to be a bit higher off the ground. So it can vary quite a bit. Really interesting to me is that consistent across many, many, many studies on the endangered Indiana bat, the average roost height is always about 11 meters. So the height probably does matter a lot, but it probably varies by bat.
Okay. On a similar note, I guess, will bats roost in non-native trees? Have any studies been done to see if they are using any of our non-native trees for roosting?
So, most of our non-native plants are not like tall trees, or bigger trees with larger diameter. They're usually smaller shrub-like things. I think one of the larger trees I can think of would be like a leyland cypress that would get pretty tall. But if you go to Florida, you've got eucalyptus trees that are pretty darn tall, and lots of things will use eucalyptus. And if there was a woodpecker cavity in it, bats would certainly use it too. Bats are keying in on structure. They're not keying in on tree species. So if the tree provides an adequate cavity or a crevice under bark and it's getting enough sunlight, it's going to be a good roost for bats. So they don't actually take an assessment of the tree species before they move in. They're just looking at the structural characteristics.
Awesome. I like this question. This is kind of the comparing the natural versus artificial roosts. So this person just said that they have a couple 100-year-old oaks on their property. Should they still put up houses, or are the trees kind of where they should stop and they shouldn't have to put up houses?
I don't think you need to put up bat boxes if you have large trees on your property. Probably your bats are finding places to live, and there's definitely other things you can do that will benefit all the bats on your property, whereas bat boxes are only going to benefit mostly a couple of species in Illinois. Depending on where you are, it might just be one species, and it's not going to solve the other problems that bats have, which is the loss of foraging habitat. Bats need a relatively large space to forage in, and clean water, which are, these are key things to support lactating females as they're feeding their pups, giving them enough energy and water to produce milk. So I would key in on those other things rather than putting up artificial roosts. I tend to think that artificial roosts will work well where, a population of bats is known to be limited in roosts, and also maybe is having a conflict with humans where they might be roosting in human spaces that we want them to avoid. So that we might provide them with artificial roosts.
Okay. That's the perfect segue to my next question. So someone did that. They had bats in their attic and had them removed, but then put in some bat houses. And they were just wondering if they need to like inspect the houses to make sure that there's no like parasites in them or diseases. I know it sounds like we put the boxes up and we leave them, but is there any cleaning or maintenance that needs to be done on those boxes?
Yeah, I would definitely consider taking the boxes down if it's possible to do so, and cleaning them out during the winter, and also sealing up cracks and crevices that might be allowing air in. We did a study, which I'm going to actually give a presentation on here in a little while at this conference, where we tested paint color effects on bat boxes. And only at the end of the study, when we looked at the data, did I realize that there was a leak in one of our boxes, because the predicted relationship of temperature to the outside air temperature and the box color dipped at one point where it really shouldn't have. And it's, oh, there must have been a leak in the box that was painted 80% black. And that, is going to impact the bats that are roosting inside that box, because it's gonna, if they are generating metabolic heat and trying to warm up that space, then that leak is just going to be like a chimney that's venting out the heat and exhaust and not allowing them to capture that heat. So that could be bad for bats. So I think sealing up boxes, adding some insulation if your box already doesn't have insulation, will make it more stable. If it's dark color, you might consider painting it a lighter color and then adding that insulation. That'll actually make it a much better roost for bats. So you always have opportunities to improve artificial roosts for bats. Invariably, they need some attention.
Okay, great. We had a question, as homeowners, what can we do to limit light pollution around our property?
Oh my goodness, I saw a presentation about light pollution and birds earlier today, and I was just thinking, man, there's so much work we need to do there, right? So if you can keep the lights off at night around your house, that would be incredible. Put a motion sensitive light on your front porch to, have the light come on when people come by, but otherwise to turn off. That'll be really beneficial for bats and birds that are migrating. You can also use a yellow bug light. I just saw one the other day at Rural King. So they literally are labeled bug light and they're yellow. They're about $5 for a bulb, I think, maybe even less, but look for that. Doug Tallamy, who's a well-known entomologist that I know you know, Aaron, his work, he recommends those because they don't attract bugs. So if actually bugs don't come to those lights, and that's why people use them, is to keep the bugs away. But that means that they're not disturbing bugs. And so bugs can do their normal thing, which is going to benefit bats, right? Because bats are going to eat those bugs. So trying to reduce light pollution using lights that either face down or that only turn on when you really need them is going to be beneficial for our bats. Of course, probably most of you have seen bats feeding around lights and feeding on bugs that are around lights, but that doesn't mean that that's good for bats, right? That disorients the bugs. It affects the bugs' behavior. It affects the bats' behavior. It'd be much better if we could try to reduce our disturbance and let bats and bugs do their natural things.
Awesome. I was going to say, if you didn't say the yellow light bulb, I was going to say it. So
Yeah.
We had another question that I'm sure you hear a lot, that people are afraid of bats because of rabies. Is this a justified fear? What do we actually need to be aware of on this topic?
Well, bats are a known vector of rabies, and rabies is a almost 100% fatal disease. If you get bitten by a bat, you should definitely go and get post-exposure shots. Go to the doctor ASAP, because the sooner you do that, the more likely it is that you're going to survive if you were bitten by a rabid bat. But if you attract bats to your house with natural or artificial roosts or to your property, that doesn't mean that you're more likely to encounter a rabid bat. Really that's going to happen when you either pick up a bat, which you should never do, or if you have a bat coming into your living space. And so for that reason, I don't encourage people to keep bats in their living spaces, although that is a common practice in some other parts of the world. People like to live with bats, but we do have rabies, whereas that's not found everywhere. And I think it's important to be mindful of that and try to give bats a space to live that's not right up against humans. So keep bats out of your living space. If a bat gets into your living space, you can use really heavy gloves to pick it up and take it outside. I recommend scooping it into a shoebox or something like that and setting the bat at the base of a tree. And it will crawl up the tree if it's healthy, and it will ultimately fly away. If you're worried about a bat in your house, you can, call animal control, and they or the health department will usually try to help capture a bat and evict it. Bats, by and large, do not have rabies, though. When we look at the wild population, less than 1% of bats are actually carrying rabies. But when we look at bats that are actually turned in to be tested, it's around 5 to 6%. So if you have a bat in your space doing something weird, it is more likely that that bat is rabid. So just be careful around bats, but you don't need to worry about bringing them to your property.
Okay. We had a couple questions just about water, bats needing water and drinking water. Will bats use bird baths as a water source?
Probably not, but nobody has really looked at that. The only way they could use a bird bath is if they landed on the edge and drank from it, just the way a bird does. They're not going to swoop down and drink, and that's how bats naturally drink. Mm-hmm. So they typically need a larger water source that they can fly down to and take a drink and then fly back up. So there's a lot of reports of people finding bats in their swimming pools, unfortunately dead, usually because they can't get out of the pool once they get in. So if you do have a pool, think about putting one of those little things on the side, like a frog tog, I think is what it's called, that bats and other animals can swim to and then get out. Bats can swim, so they will be able to find that, hopefully. But for a bird bath, it's pretty unlikely. But that doesn't mean that you might not want to keep a bird bath around, because I'm sure the birds really like it.
I did not know that bats could swim. That's going to be my new fun fact that I learned today. Okay, as we close out today, just one last question. If someone is looking for a resource, if they can find what types of bats are where in the US, do you have like a go-to place where that information is easily found, or would it be more of like a book resource on bats with distribution maps?
Yeah, there's a website that the Bat Conservation International maintains. Their website is batcon.org, and they actually have range maps for every species. They're a little bit non-specific, so you can't zoom in super well to see what's where in parts of Illinois, for example, but you can kind of get an overlap. And the Midwest is really interesting. So like I mentioned, as you move north in Illinois, we lose a bunch of species, and Illinois and Missouri are the most diverse states in the Midwest, and everything else is missing 1 or 2 species or even more. So it is largely dependent on where you live. But try checking out that batcon.org site. And we also have a site called midwestbathub.illinois.edu, where we maintain data and work with volunteers to collect data on bats around the Midwest. And you're welcome to reach out to us through that page.
Awesome. I am dropping those into the chat for folks that are still on, if you want to grab that link real quick. But we are at 2:00, so we will wrap up for the day. Thank you again, Joy, for this great information presentation. Really appreciate having you on.
Thank you for tuning into CUWise TV. We hope you enjoyed the show. This video can be accessed anytime on youtube.com. In the YouTube search bar, type in UPTV6 and look for their microphone logo. We hope you will join us again next week for more local, engaging content designed specifically for Champaign County older adults. Take care and stay safe.